Hey everyone, today we're diving into the incredible story of Chief Olusegun Matthew Okikiola, Ogunboye Aremu Obasanjo, or as he's popularly known, OBJ, a man who's seen it all, from military coups to presidential power play. Whether you know him as Nigeria's military hero or a controversial leader, you're in for a ride through his incredible journey. So grab a seat, hit that subscribe button, and let's get into the story that shaped a nation. He's the author of the book This Animal Called Man, and a Nigerian general and statesman who led the country twice, first as head of state from 1976 to 1979, and then as president from 1999 to 2007. Oh, and he was part of the People's Democratic Party, PDP, from 1998 all the way till 2015 and rejoined it in 2018. Let's rewind to where it all began. March 5, 1937, in a little village called Olusegun in Yoruba land, southwestern Nigeria. That's where Obasanjo was born to his father, Amos Adigun Obaluwayesanjo Bankole, a farmer, and his mother Bernice Ashabi Bankole, who was a homemaker. As the eldest of 9 kids, only he and his sister Aduni survived to adulthood. He was born into the Owu segment of the Yoruba ethnic group, and his village's local church was connected to a mission started by the U.S. Southern Baptist Church, so he was raised with Baptist teachings. From a young age, Obasanjo was out in the fields farming alongside his dad. But he didn't just stick to farming. He also started formal schooling at the village primary school. Fast forward to 1951, and he's at the Baptist Day School in the Owu quarter of Abeokuta. The next year, he moved on to the Baptist Boys High School, and his education was partly covered by state grants. He was a smart kid, excelling in school, and even joined the Boy Scouts. Fun fact, during this time, he rejected the name Matthew as a personal stand against colonial rule. When Obasanjo's dad left, his mom started trading to support the family. Meanwhile, Obasanjo had to work odd jobs to fund his education, including some manual labor during school holidays. In 1956, he took his secondary school exams and even had to borrow money for the entry fee. That same year, he started dating Oluremi Akinlawan, the daughter of a station master from Owu. By 1958, they were engaged. After finishing school, Obasanjo moved to Ibadan to work as a teacher. Even past the entrance exam for University College Ibadan, tuition costs held him back. So he switched paths, opting for civil engineering. And in 1958, he applied for officer cadet training in the Nigerian Army. He joined the Nigerian Army in March 1958, mostly because it was a way to further his education, while also getting paid. But he didn't tell his family at first, worried they wouldn't approve. At the time, the Nigerian Army was shifting toward local control in preparation for the country's independence, so they were promoting more Nigerians into leadership roles. Obasanjo got sent to the regular officers' training school in Teshi, Ghana, and even while stationed abroad, he kept sending letters and gifts to his fiancée back home. By September 1958, he was selected for more training, this time at Mons Officer Cadet School in Aldershot, England. England wasn't the dream he'd imagined, though. He found the environment classist and racist, and don't even get him started on the weather. It only deepened his distaste for British colonial rule. After completing his training, he got his engineering certificate and a commission. While he was away, he sadly lost both his parents. Mom passed first, followed by his dad a year later. When Obasanjo returned to Nigeria in 1959, he was posted in Kaduna as an infantry subaltern with the 5th Battalion. And this is where things get interesting. Nigeria had just gained independence in 1960, and his unit got deployed to the Congo as part of a UN peacekeeping mission. They were based in Kivu province, and his job was to protect civilians, including the Belgian minority, from rebels fighting against Patrice Lumumba's government. During one mission in February 1961, Obasanjo was actually captured by mutineers while evacuating Roman Catholic missionaries. He was nearly executed but was eventually freed. That was a close call. His unit returned to Nigeria in May 1961, and by the end of the Congo mission, he had been promoted to captain. He later said that the experience had fired up a strong sense of Pan-African unity in him. Back home, Obasanjo bought his first car and was briefly hospitalized for a stomach ulcer. Once he recovered, he was reassigned to the Army Engineering Corps. and in 1962, he went back to England to study at the Royal College of Military Engineering. Fun fact, he was noted as the best Commonwealth student ever during his time there. That same year, he helped finance his fiancée Olusegun's trip to London for training, and they eventually tied the knot in 1963. The wedding was pretty low-key, just a small ceremony at Camberwell Green Registry Office in London. Obasanjo returned to Nigeria after the wedding. Olusegu stayed in London for another 3 years to finish her studies. Back in Nigeria, he kept climbing the ranks, becoming a major in 1965. Along the way, he bought land in Ibadan, Kaduna, and Lagos with his army pay. That same year, he traveled to India to study at the Defense Services Staff College and the School of Engineering in Pune. His time in India left a big impression on him. He was struck by the poverty, but also became fascinated with Indian culture and started exploring different religions through books. When Obasanjo returned to Nigeria in January 1966, he walked straight into the chaos of a military coup led by Major Emmanuel Ifeanyi. Most of the coup plotters were Igbo, and tensions were high across the country. Obasanjo, always the diplomat, offered to step in as a mediator between the coup leaders and the civilian government, between the coup plotters and the civilian government, which had transferred power to the military commander-in-chief, Johnson Agui Ironsi. So after Ironsi took control, things got tense real quick. Obasanjo found himself in the thick of it when another coup broke out in July 1966. This time, northern troops went rogue, killing Ironsi and a bunch of Igbo soldiers. The whole country was on edge. General Yakubu Gowon took over as the new leader, and Obasanjo, stationed in Maiduguri at the time, rushed back to Kaduna to witness firsthand how bad things had gotten. The northern soldiers were going after the Igbo with a vengeance. And though Obasanjo wasn't Igbo, being a southerner made him a potential target. Lucky for him, Governor Hassan Katsina of northern Nigeria stepped in and moved Obasanjo and his wife to safety in Maiduguri for a while, just until things calmed down. Fast forward to January 1967, and Obasanjo was back in Lagos, this time as the chief army engineer. Ethnic tensions hadn't cooled, though. By May of that year, C. Odumegwu Ojukwu, an Igbo military officer, decided enough was enough. He declared the southeastern Igbo-majority regions as independent, calling it the Republic of Biafra. It wasn't long before the fighting started in July. Obasanjo was sent to Ibadan, trying to keep Biafran troops from advancing towards Lagos. He didn't let them through. Then Obasanjo got promoted again, this time to rear commander of Murtala Muhammad's 2nd Division, responsible for the Midwest. His job? Keeping that division supplied. Meanwhile, back in Ibadan, he was still teaching military science at the University of Ibadan and staying connected with Yoruba leaders. Things weren't easy in the western state, though. There was unrest, and Obasanjo decided to resign from the Western State Executive Council to avoid being blamed for the chaos. But as the war dragged on, General Gowon decided it was time for a change. He replaced Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, who was leading the attack on Biafra, with none other than Obasanjo. Despite having no combat experience, Obasanjo took command in May 1969. He jumped into action, getting injured in the process, but it earned him some serious respect. By the end of 1969, he launched Operation Finishing Touch, capturing Umuahia on Christmas Day. That move basically split Biafra in two. And then came January 1970. Obasanjo kicked off Operation Tailwind, which led to Biafra's surrender. By January 13th, he was face-to-face with Biafran military commander Philip Effiong, laying down the terms of surrender. Despite the fear of Nigerian army atrocities, Obasanjo made sure his troops stayed in line, cracking down on anyone who stepped out of bounds. His efforts to restore services like the water supply in war-torn regions solidified his reputation as a hero. By May of that year, things were getting back on track in most towns. Obasanjo returned to Abeokuta in June 1970 to a hero's welcome. But it wasn't long before he was back to work in Lagos as brigadier in charge of the Corps of Engineers. Gowon announced a plan to transition to civilian rule by 1979. Progress was slow. Obasanjo also started investing in properties and businesses around this time, despite rumors of corruption, though nothing was ever proven. His personal life took a hit too, with his marriage to Aremu falling apart in the mid-70s. He remarried Stella Abebe in 1976. Now, July 1975 brought yet another twist. There was a coup led by Shehu Musa Yar'Adua and Joseph Garba that ousted Gowon. Obasanjo wasn't even in on the plan since everyone knew he was against coups. They put Murtala Muhammad in charge with Obasanjo as his deputy. Together, they got to work, implementing austerity measures, tackling corruption, and starting a transition to civilian rule. Obasanjo took a major role in shaping the new constitution and setting up 7 new states, including Ogun, where his hometown Abeokuta became the capital. Things were looking up. But then February 1976 brought tragedy. Murtala was assassinated in a failed coup attempt by Colonel Bukasuka Dimka. Obasanjo was almost killed too, but the assassins got the wrong guy. With Murtala gone, the pressure was on Obasanjo to take over as head of state. Reluctantly, he stepped up, continuing Murtala's policies and cracking down hard on those involved in the coup attempt. So, Obasanjo knew that to keep the country together, he had to keep things balanced. That's why he made General Shehu Yar'Adua his second-in-command and Theophilus Danjuma the chief of army staff. These guys formed what was basically the big 3 in the military government. But not everyone was happy about Obasanjo picking Yar'Adua. Some folks were wondering why a Yoruba Christian like Obasanjo didn't just choose another Yoruba Christian as his deputy instead of a northern Muslim. But Obasanjo had his eyes on the bigger picture. He was all about unity, not playing into regional or religious divisions. Obasanjo wasn't just talking about unity. He wanted everyone to feel it. That's why he pushed for people, kids and adults alike, to memorize the new national anthem and pledge. It was a way of reminding everyone that, despite all the differences, they were all Nigerian. He also loved getting a mix of voices at the table. He'd host these informal Saturday seminars, bringing in everyone from politicians to Islamic scholars and traditional leaders just to hear a range of perspectives. Now let's talk about the economy. By the mid-1970s, things were starting to spiral a bit, with inflation hitting 34%. Not great. So in 1976, Obasanjo rolled out some serious austerity measures, cutting government spending by a whopping 1/6. He wanted to pull back on flashy projects and instead pump more money into education, healthcare, housing, and agriculture. On top of that, he set up an anti-inflation task force, and within a year, inflation dropped to 30%. Not too shabby. Obasanjo wasn't a fan of borrowing money, but he knew when to bend the rules a bit. He took out a $1 billion loan backed by the World Bank and IMF, which didn't sit well with some left-wing groups who thought he was selling out to Western interests. Over the next 2 years, though, Nigeria borrowed nearly $5 billion more. And then there was the population boom. Obasanjo later admitted he didn't even realize Nigeria's population was growing at a crazy rate, almost 3% a year. If it kept up, the population would double in 25 years. This led to rapid urbanization and, you guessed it, major housing crunch. Obasanjo's 1976 budget promised 200,000 new houses by 1980. They only managed to finish about 28,500. He also tried to keep things affordable with rent and price controls. He went after unions, making sure strikes didn't shut down essential services. In agriculture, Obasanjo kept the projects that Murtala had started, like the Kano River Project and the South Chad Irrigation Project. He also backed reforestation efforts to fight desertification in the north and greenlit new hydroelectric and thermal power plants to meet the country's growing demand for electricity. Oil was still king in Nigeria's economy, and Obasanjo oversaw the creation of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation (NNPC) by merging 2 major oil bodies. He also supported the Bani liquefaction plant project, though his successor eventually abandoned it. But here's the thing. Nigeria's agriculture was on a decline because the government found it easier to just import food instead of growing it. Obasanjo wanted to fix that, so he launched Operation Feed the Nation in 1976, trying to get people back to farming. Students even had to work on farms during holidays. He threw in subsidies for fertilizers, made farming equipment tax-free, and made it easier for farmers to get credit. In 1978, he passed the Land Use Decree, basically transferring land ownership to the state. While the left loved it, Landowners were not too happy. But Obasanjo saw it as a big win for his government. Obasanjo also kept pushing for more education. He took over a plan from Gowon to offer free primary education to all, and by the end of his term, enrollment had doubled from 6 million to over 12 million kids in school. He even expanded free education to cover secondary school by 1979. But there was a downside. University funding took a hit. Fees for food and accommodation tripled, and that sparked some massive student protests. In places like Lagos and Zaria, those protests turned violent and people lost their lives. Obasanjo wasn't having it. He shut down several universities, banned political activities on campus, and dissolved the National Union of Nigerian Students. He wasn't shy about saying that he thought the students were stepping out of line, especially when they weren't showing the kind of respect for elders that he valued. Then there was the corruption problem. People started pointing fingers at the government, saying corruption was everywhere. Obasanjo didn't like that image, so he banned government officials from using flashy Mercedes cars, swapping them out for Peugeots, and put a stop to champagne imports. He even demobilized 12,000 soldiers in 76 and 77, helping them transition back into civilian life. But there were darker moments too. Obasanjo's government was heavily criticized for cracking down on political dissent. One of the most infamous incidents was the raid on Fela Kuti's Calcutta Republic, where Fela and his family were attacked. His mother, legendary Chief Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, was thrown out of a window and later died from her injuries. Fela responded by delivering a coffin to Obasanjo's doorstep, a powerful statement against the government's brutality. Despite all the internal challenges, Obasanjo wanted Nigeria to stand tall on the world stage. He was determined to boost Nigeria's profile as a leader in Africa. He revived Gowon's idea of hosting the World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, known as Festac 77, in Lagos. It was a huge deal, even though some Nigerians criticized the event for being too expensive. Obasanjo didn't care. He wanted Nigeria to shine. During Obasanjo's time in office, Nigeria started to shift away from its long-standing close ties with the UK. And instead, Obasanjo began cozying up to the US. It wasn't because Obasanjo suddenly had a thing for American culture or anything. It was more practical than that. For one, Jimmy Carter had just been elected president in 1976, and Carter was all about supporting majority rule in Africa, especially in southern African countries still under white minority rule. Obasanjo liked that. Plus, Obasanjo struck up a good personal friendship with Andrew Young, the U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, which only helped strengthen the ties between the two countries. Carter even visited Nigeria in 1978, which was a big deal at the time. At the same time, Obasanjo wasn't exactly thrilled with the UK anymore. The discovery of North Sea oil made the UK more of a competitor to Nigeria in the oil market rather than a customer. And to top it off, the British refused to extradite Gowon back to Nigeria after the coup against Murtala. There were even rumors floating around that the Brits had a hand in the coup. So, Obasanjo basically gave the UK the cold shoulder. He didn't cut diplomatic ties, but he made sure to avoid visiting, and he discouraged his officials from going there either. Things only got worse when Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, and she was all about keeping white minority governments in southern Africa in place. Nigeria responded by seizing a British tanker suspected of moving Nigerian oil to South Africa, banning British firms from bidding on Nigerian contracts, and taking over British Petroleum's operations in the country. Obasanjo's foreign policy was centered on ending white minority rule in southern Africa, and he made sure Nigeria was at the forefront of that fight. Nigeria backed anti-apartheid groups with money, gave them space to operate in Lagos, and even provided refuge for those fleeing oppressive regimes in southern Africa. Obasanjo wasn't playing around. He even boycotted the 1976 Summer Olympics because New Zealand wouldn't cut ties with South Africa. He also put the squeeze on contractors with South African ties, like British Petroleum and Barclays Bank, making it tough for them to do business in Nigeria. In 1977, Nigeria hosted a big United Nations conference for action against apartheid in Lagos. And when Obasanjo visited the US, he straight up asked them to stop selling arms to South Africa. He also addressed the United Nations General Assembly, and Nigeria ended up landing a seat on the United Nations Security Council. Obasanjo's stance on Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was just as strong. He supported the armed struggle against the government there and worked to bring together the different anti-government factions. He wanted Robert Mugabe of ZANU to join forces with Joshua Nkomo of ZAPU, make their fight more effective. For a while, Obasanjo backed a UK and US plan for Rhodesia's transition to majority rule, pushing for it during trips to places like Tanzania and Zambia. But when Thatcher came into power, Nigeria started distancing itself from British-led efforts. And while Nigeria didn't play a huge role in the eventual democratic elections in Rhodesia, Obasanjo's influence was definitely felt. Back home, Obasanjo was a key player in the Organization of African Unity, OAU. He was always pushing for ways to make Africa more unified, proposing things like a Pan-African military force for peacekeeping and a standing committee to help mediate disputes between member states. He also worked hard to mediate conflict, the Chadian Civil War. Even though Nigeria managed to broker a ceasefire and form a national unity government, the war dragged on and Nigeria eventually had to cut off oil supplies to Chad. Obasanjo also tried, but didn't quite succeed, to mediate disputes between Ethiopia and Somalia, as well as between Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Toward the end of his time in office, he led an OAU mission to address the conflict in Western Sahara. As Nigeria started to transition back to civilian rule, Obasanjo's government set up a committee to draft a new constitution. The goal was to move away from the British parliamentary system and adopt something more like the US presidential system, with checks and balances to keep any one person from grabbing too much power. The draft was published in October 1976, and after a year of public debate, it was discussed by a constituent assembly in October 1977. The assembly ran into some serious disagreements, especially around the role of Sharia law, and Obasanjo had to step in, telling them to think about the bigger picture and urging them to compromise. The final version of the Constitution was announced in September 1978, and it included a bunch of amendments based on the debates. At the same time, Obasanjo lifted the ban on political parties, and soon enough, new ones started popping up, like the Unity Party of Yoruba, the Nigerian People's Party, and the National Party of Nigeria. But Obasanjo wasn't too thrilled with the way politicians were making promises they couldn't possibly keep. The elections that followed in 1979 were marred by low turnout and accusations of rigging, but at least they went off peacefully. In the end, Shehu Shagari was declared the winner, beating out Obafemi Awolowo. Shagari was inaugurated in October 1979, and just like that, Nigeria's Second Republic was born. Even though Obasanjo's handling of the transition earned him a lot of respect, not everyone was happy, especially the Yoruba elite, who accused him of manipulating things to favor Shagari instead of backing Awolowo. Some even thought Obasanjo had orchestrated Shagari's victory on purpose. By April 1979, before officially stepping down, Obasanjo got a promotion to general. He kept his state salary after leaving office in October. He headed back to Abeokuta and decided to give farming a shot, taking a 6-week agricultural training course. He bought about 230 hectares of land in Oda and set up his farm. There was some local opposition and a few lawsuits, but that didn't stop him. His farm became a big deal, run under Temperance Enterprises Limited, which was later renamed Obasanjo's Farms Limited. By the mid-1980s, the farm was producing 140,000 chicks every week and had expanded to other cities in southwestern Nigeria. Even employed over 400 people by 1987. He also gave back by supporting poor students at his old school in Abeokuta, continuing the Yoruba tradition of wealthy benefactors helping out. But Obasanjo wasn't done with politics entirely. He grew more and more critical of President Shehu Shagari's government, calling it ineffective and saying they weren't prepared for the job. The Nigerian economy was tanking due to global oil price swings, and by May 1983, some high-ranking military officials even asked Obasanjo to step back into power. He said no, though. A few months later, Shagari was overthrown in a coup and Muhammadu Buhari took over. At first, Obasanjo liked what Buhari was doing, praising his war against indiscipline and moves to cut imports and balance the budget. But by the time Buhari was replaced by Ibrahim Babangida, Obasanjo had started to voice his concerns, especially when it came to Babangida's economic reforms, like devaluing the naira. So after stepping down from the presidency, Obasanjo didn't just fade into the background. Nah, the guy stayed busy. During the 11 years after his presidency, he turned into quite the author. In 1980, he dropped My Command, which was basically his take on the Civil War and what went down during that time. Some people weren't too happy with it, especially those who thought he wasn't loyal enough to Murtala Muhammad. But hey, folks like Ken Saro-Wiwa gave it a thumbs up, so there was that. Then in 1987, he put out another book called Nzeogwu, which was a tribute to his friend Chukwuma Nzeogwu. By 1989, he was back with Constitution for National Integration and Development, where he didn't hold back on criticizing Babangida's whole two-party system idea. The man wasn't shy about speaking his mind. And in 1990, he dropped Not My Will, giving everyone the inside scoop on his time in government. Now, if you thought Obasanjo was just chilling on his farm writing books, think again. The guy was still making moves on the global stage. From his Oda farm, kicked off the Africa Leadership Forum to stay relevant in the international community. And he was all over the place. He was part of the Palm Commission from 1981 to 1982, talking about disarmament and global security. He was even involved in panels for the UN, WHO, and the Interaction Council of former heads of government. There was even a push for him to become the UN Secretary General, but that didn't pan out. Instead, Boutros Ghali snagged the gig. One of the biggest things Obasanjo got into was the whole fight against apartheid in South Africa. He got nominated to co-chair this big group called the Eminent Persons Group, EPG, with Malcolm Fraser. Obasanjo even met Nelson Mandela in 1986, and he was super impressed by him. When Obasanjo went to South Africa later that year, he sat down with some government big shots, including the Prime Minister. But, surprise, surprise, they weren't down for any real change. The EPG basically said the world needed to turn up the heat on South Africa. But Obasanjo was frustrated by how slowly things were moving. Eventually, he led a Commonwealth committee that looked into what the frontline states needed for defense. When F.W. de Klerk took over and Mandela finally walked free, Obasanjo didn't miss a beat. He hosted Mandela in Nigeria and pushed for talks with all the different groups in South Africa. But that wasn't all. Obasanjo was traveling all over the place. In 1988, he went to Angola twice to try and help with peace efforts. And, between 1987 and 1989, he visited Sudan several times, trying to mediate the Second Sudanese Civil War. By 1994, he was even in Mozambique, keeping an eye on their general election. And in Burundi, he was working hard to ease tensions between the different ethnic groups. The guy was basically Africa's go-to mediator. On top of all that, he kept pushing for stronger African unity and even started the Africa Leadership Forum in 1987, held regular meetings, and put out a magazine called Africa Forum for a few years. By the early 90s, though, Obasanjo was starting to get pretty worried about what was happening in Nigeria. Even though Babangida was talking a big game about returning to democratic governance, Obasanjo was skeptical. He didn't think Babangida had any real intention of giving up power. And when the presidential primaries got cancelled in 1992, that was the last straw for Obasanjo. He teamed up with Anthony Anahoro to start the Association for Democracy and Good Governance in Nigeria, and their first meeting at OTA in May 1993 brought together 31 big political names from all over Nigeria. When the presidential election finally happened in June 1993, it looked like Moshood Abiola of the Social Democratic Party, SDP, had won. But things quickly got messy. Babangida annulled the election results. This move caused major drama. Abiola was supposed to be the new president, but instead, Babangida promised another election. Of course, the SDP wasn't having any of it. They insisted Abiola had already won. So Babangida, under pressure, stepped down, and an interim government led by Ernest Shonekan took over in August 1993. Plan was to hold new elections by February 1994. But then, General Sani Abacha came into the picture. Abacha had his eyes on power, and by November 1993, he pressured Shonekan into resigning. And just like that, Abacha was in charge. Obasanjo had tried to warn Abacha not to go down that path, but his advice fell on deaf ears. Once Abacha was in control, he tried to bring Obasanjo into his new government, but Obasanjo wasn't having it. He refused to support Abacha's rule unless there was a clear plan for a return to democracy. And things just kept escalating. Obasanjo was worried that Nigeria was heading towards civil unrest, especially with all the ethnic tensions bubbling under the surface. In May 1994, he co-founded the National Unity Promoters with Shehu Yar'Adua, aiming to calm things down. But then, in June 1994, Abiola took matters into his own hands, declaring himself president. That move got him arrested for treason, and Obasanjo, while not in full support of Abiola's self-declaration, thought arresting him was a bad idea. He stepped up to try and get Abacha and Abiola to sit down and talk it out. But many of Obasanjo's Yoruba supporters didn't like his approach and felt betrayed. They wanted him to stand with Abiola, and when he didn't, they retaliated by attacking his property in Yorubaland. That was tough for Obasanjo. He felt like he was being punished for trying to keep a neutral stance, rather than picking sides based on ethnic loyalty. And this is where things start to get even more intense for Obasanjo. During his presidency, Obasanjo utilized oil revenues to initiate several key programs, including the creation of the Niger Delta Development Commission and the Universal Basic Education Program, aimed at improving literacy levels in Nigeria. He used those oil revenues to kick off some major programs, like setting up the Niger Delta Development Commission and the Universal Basic Education Program. The goal? Improve literacy and tackle corruption. He even launched the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission and the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission to clean up the mess. He didn't stop there. Obasanjo breathed new life into the National Fertilizer Company in Kaduna and revitalized Oniport Import Harcourt. And let's not forget, he bumped up the share of oil royalties going to the states from 3 to 13%. Before Obasanjo took over, Nigeria's GDP growth was pretty sluggish, but he managed to get things moving. By March 1995, while he was at a UN summit in Copenhagen, caught wind of trouble back home. Yar'Adua was in detention, and his own safety was in question. Still, he headed back to Nigeria, only to have his passport snatched and get arrested at his Oda home. They accused him of being involved in a coup plot led by Colonel Lawan Gwadabe. Obasanjo was shuffled between detention centers, and despite former U.S. President Jimmy Carter stepping in, he was stuck under house arrest for 2 months with no media, phone, or visitors. Colonel Bello Fadil, another guy in the hot seat, was tortured into implicating Obasanjo. This was used as a charge against him for treason. He was eventually moved to the State Security Interrogation Center at Ikoyi and tried in a military court on June 19, 1995. Even though Obasanjo denied the charges and Bello Fadile later retracted his confession, Obasanjo got hit with a 25-year sentence, while some others got death sentences. Thanks to international pressure, especially from U.S. President Bill Clinton, Abacha decided to reduce Obasanjo's sentence, 15 years. Obasanjo's time in prison started rough. 4 months in solitary confinement at Ikoyi, then transferred to the overcrowded and unsanitary Kirikiri prison. He dealt with health issues like hypertension and diabetes, but managed to get some better reading materials and correspondence privilege. During this time, Nelson Mandela and Pope John Paul II spoke up for his release, and he was even honored with awards from various international groups. The Africa Leadership Forum, which had moved to Ghana to dodge Abacha's crackdown, published volumes of letters and essays in his honor. By early 1996, Obasanjo was moved to the remote Yola prison in Adamawa State. There, he grew a garden and dove deeper into his Christian faith, becoming a born-again Christian. Preached weekly, wrote sermons for later publication, and tried to help reform younger prisoners. He was also paranoid about being poisoned, especially after Yar'Adua's death, which was rumored to be a result of poisoning. Then, in June 1998, Abacha suddenly died and Major General Abdulsalami Abubakar took over. A week later, Abubakar ordered Obasanjo's release. The new administration was all about bringing Nigeria back to civilian rule, dissolving existing parties and institutions, and setting up for a new civilian president by May 1999. Once free, Obasanjo went on a medical trip to South Africa, the UK, and the US. Back home, new political parties were emerging, and the People's Democratic Party, PDP, was on the rise. They saw Obasanjo as the perfect candidate for president, believing his international clout and military background would help keep things stable. Despite worries from his friends and family about his safety and reputation, Obasanjo joined the PDP on October 28 and threw his hat in the ring for the presidential nomination. His campaign was all about restoring the good governance he'd pushed for before he left office in 1979. He raised a lot of money, including big donations from industrialist Aliko Dangote, and hit the campaign trail nationwide. At the PDP's February 1999 convention, Obasanjo snagged the presidential nomination. He picked Atiku Abubakar as his running mate, and when the presidential election rolled around on February 27, faced off against Olufale of the APP. Even though there were some shady moves during the election, Obasanjo won with 63% of the vote. However, he did lose in all 6 states of his home turf, Yorubaland. When he took office in May 1999, after a traditional exorcism ritual, he officially took the presidential oath at Abuja's Eagle Square. Put together a cabinet with an equal number of ministers from both northern and southern Nigeria. But this led to some grumbling from Muslim northerners who felt left out. Critics said his cabinet was outdated and lacked economic experience. Still, during his first term, Nigerians saw more freedoms, including a press that could openly criticize his presidency. Obasanjo shook things up by retiring around 200 military officers, including all 93 who held political positions. This move was meant to lower the chances of a coup. He also moved the defense ministry from Lagos to Abuja to bring it under tighter control. In the 2003 elections, things got contentious. Obasanjo was re-elected amidst ethnic and religious violence. His main rival was General Muhammadu Buhari, and Obasanjo won with 61.8% of the vote, beating Buhari by over 11 million votes. In November 2003, Obasanjo faced some heat for giving asylum to exiled Liberian President Charles Taylor. On June 12, 2006, he signed the Green Tree Agreement with Cameroonian President Paul Biya, settling the Bakassi Peninsula border dispute. Even though the Nigerian Senate was against pulling troops out of Bakassi, Obasanjo went ahead with it. During his second term, Obasanjo grew the police force to 325,000 by 2007 and declared a state of emergency in Plateau State in May 2004 due to violence between Muslims and Christians, which led to 6 months of military rule. On August 22, 2005, Abia State Governor Orji Uzur Kalu submitted a petition accusing Obasanjo of corruption to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC. Then came the drama over Obasanjo's third-term agenda, which was all about amending the constitution to let him run for a third term. This idea sparked a massive uproar in politics and the media, and it was eventually shot down by the National Assembly. Obasanjo claimed he wasn't personally pushing for a third term and that it was just part of broader constitutional amendments. He even said, "I never toyed with the idea of a third term." Big names in politics were calling him out. Senator Ken Nnamani, former Senate president, said Obasanjo had mentioned his third-term plans and hinted that a huge amount of money, around 8 billion naira, was used to sway legislators. Femi Gbajabiamila backed this up but estimated the amount to be over $10 billion. Nnamani also mentioned that U.S. President George W. Bush had advised Obasanjo against seeking a third term, as noted in Condoleezza Rice's autobiography. Bush apparently told Obasanjo to be patriotic and step down by May 29, 2007. Even with these controversies, Obasanjo's presidency saw Nigeria's GDP growth bounce back, reaching 6% thanks to rising oil prices. Foreign reserves grew from $2 billion in 1999 to a whopping $43 billion by the end of his presidency. Obasanjo also managed to negotiate some serious debt relief, securing forgiveness for about $18 billion in debt and paying off another $18 billion. He tackled a tough economic situation, marked by high inflation and unemployment, and rolled out programs to fight poverty and boost employment. He even got the IMF to look at Nigeria's economic issues and took steps to reform the public sector. So Obasanjo tried to shake things up by getting rid of the petrol subsidy, which meant raising fuel prices to match the market rates. This didn't sit well with everyone, and a general strike led by the Nigerian Labour Congress in June 2000 forced him to back down a bit. He cut the subsidy but didn't get rid of it entirely, which gave him a bit of a bad rep as an enemy of the poor. To cut down on government spending, Obasanjo went for privatization. He set up the National Council on Privatization in July 1999 with the aim of selling off a bunch of public enterprises, 588 in total. But he kept the oil production stuff under government control. Privatization didn't get the warmest reception, though. A 2000 survey showed only 35% of people were into it. He also tried to tackle Nigeria's massive debt. But while Canada, Italy, and the US forgave some smaller debts, bigger creditors like the UK weren't having it. Obasanjo was pretty vocal about corruption being Nigeria's big problem. Transparency International had ranked Nigeria as the world's most corrupt country in 2000. He pushed an anti-corruption bill through the National Assembly early on, but it got watered down before he signed it into law in June 2000. Corruption kept being a problem, especially at state and local levels. Health was another area Obasanjo focused on. Nigeria had been spending just 0.2% of its GDP on health, the lowest globally. Obasanjo's administration upped that to over 0.4%. The HIV/AIDS crisis was a huge deal, so he set up a presidential committee on AIDS and a national action plan committee to boost awareness, training, counseling, and testing. They also kicked off a campaign to build a clinic in each of Nigeria's 774 local government areas. Restoring Nigeria's international reputation was on his to-do list, too. Obasanjo spent a lot of time abroad, visiting 92 countries by October 2002. He set up a South African-Nigerian binational commission in 1999, strengthened ties with South Africa, and kept good relations with the US, earning support from Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. He even got an honorary knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II in 2003. When it came to military matters, Obasanjo had pledged to pull Nigerian troops out of Sierra Leone. By August 1999, he had a plan in place. It was delayed until a UN peacekeeping force could take over. He also sent troops into Liberia in 2003, but they were placed under UN command later. He offered refuge to Liberia's ousted leader Charles Taylor, but later extradited him to face war crimes charges. Obasanjo stayed out of some unpopular conflicts, turning down requests for Nigerian military involvement in Guinea-Bissau and Côte d'Ivoire. However, he did step in to mediate conflicts, like the land disputes in Zimbabwe, working with South African President Thabo Mbeki and Australian Prime Minister John Howard, urged Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe to either retire or share power with the opposition. A major issue during Obasanjo's presidency was the debate over Islamic Sharia law. In September 1999, Governor Ahmed Sani of Zamfara State introduced Sharia law for penal cases, only for Muslims. This stirred up trouble with Christian communities in the north, leading to protests and clashes. Obasanjo decided not to get involved in this debate, choosing instead to deal with the situation as a political trend rather than a constitutional issue. By 2000, 4 more northern states had adopted Sharia law, with 7 more joining in 2001. Obasanjo later said this was the biggest challenge of his presidency. With widespread violence and unrest growing due to rapid population growth and competition for land, Obasanjo boosted the police force from 120,000 to 240,000 between 1999 and 2003. But police brutality and ethnic tensions persisted, causing some to worry about Nigeria's stability. Obasanjo focused on non-military solutions, preferring forgiveness, amnesty, and reconciliation over force. In the Niger Delta, where indigenous groups wanted a bigger share of oil revenue, Obasanjo proposed a bill to create the Niger Delta Development Commission in July 1999. It was established in December 2000. He sent army battalions to confront the Asawana Boys, an Ijaw group, but the military operation led to significant destruction and loss of life. Obasanjo described it as regrettable but didn't offer an apology or compensation. though the Niger Delta Development Commission later worked on rebuilding efforts. Obasanjo also cracked down on ethnic violence, banning the Oodua People's Congress (OPC) in 2000 and arresting its leaders. In Plateau State, ethnic violence between Christians and Muslims led to about 500 deaths in 2001, before the army restored order. Obasanjo visited to promote reconciliation. He also tried to address violent groups like the Bakassi Boys and handle various unrest situations, including explosions and ethnic conflict. In the end, after facing impeachment attempts and a lot of controversies, Obasanjo managed to stay in office and was re-nominated for another term. After his presidency, he took on the role of chairman of the PDP Board of Trustees, but stepped down in April 2012. In March 2008, a Nigerian parliamentary committee accused him of awarding $2.2 billion in energy contracts during his time in office, but the case never officially went anywhere due to allegations of investigation manipulation. In May 2014, Obasanjo reached out to President Goodluck Jonathan to help mediate the release of the Chibok girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram militants. It was a big move showing his ongoing concern for national issues. Then, in February 2015, Obasanjo made headlines by publicly ditching the ruling party. He even tore up his membership card at a press conference and threw his support behind the opposition party, APC. Fast forward to January 2018, and Obasanjo was at it again, sending a letter to President Muhammadu Buhari, giving him a pretty harsh critique and advising him not to run for re-election. Seems like Obasanjo's letters to current presidents often mark a bump in their political road. Later that month, on January 31, 2018, Obasanjo launched his own political movement, called the Coalition for Nigeria Movement, CNM, in Abuja. By May 2018, it merged with the African Democratic Congress, ADC. By November 20, 2018, Obasanjo made a U-turn and rejoined the PDP during a book launch by former President Goodluck Jonathan. Come January 22, 2022, Obasanjo announced his retirement from active partisan politics. He had a meeting with PDP delegates at his home in Ogun State. It was his way of stepping back from the political limelight. Obasanjo also took on some significant roles internationally. He was appointed as special envoy by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon to the Democratic Republic of Congo, meeting with both President Joseph Kabila and rebel leader Laurent Nkunda. In the 2013 Zimbabwean elections, Obasanjo led a delegation of African Union election observers, and in 2022, he played a crucial role in facilitating peace talks between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, helping to bring about a ceasefire on November 2, 2022. Obasanjo didn't stop there. He defended his PhD thesis in theology at the National Open University of Nigeria (NOUN) in December 2017, earning his doctorate about 2 years after finishing his master's degree in the same field. Obasanjo was known for his strong Nigerian nationalist stance. He wanted Nigeria to stay unified and avoid ethnic divisions, fearing that fragmentation would lead to conflicts similar to the Yugoslav wars. He valued Nigerian citizenship over ethnic identity and was open to different political structures, though he had supported a one-party system if needed. Political views shifted over time, initially backing a one-party system with public participation and respect for human rights. He later embraced multi-party democracy. Africa moved away from single-party rule. Obasanjo was known for his practical approach to politics, often adapting to changing circumstances, rather than sticking strictly to ideology. Obasanjo led a polygamous life. His first marriage was to Oluremi Akinlawan in London in 1963, and their daughter Iyabo was born in 1967. However, their marriage ended in divorce in the mid-1970s due to conflicts over Obasanjo's relationships with other women. He later had a common-law relationship with NTA reporter Gold Oru, with whom he had 2 children. In 1976, he married his second wife, Stella Abebe, with whom he had 3 children. Obasanjo also had a relationship with businesswoman Linda Soares, who was sadly murdered by car thieves in 1986. On October 23, 2005, Obasanjo lost his wife Stella, who was the First Lady of Nigeria, due to complications from surgery in Spain. The doctor responsible was sentenced to prison. and ordered to pay restitution. Obasanjo kept his personal life fairly private, and some of his children had issues with how he treated their mothers. His son Ogunboye Obasanjo served as a brigadier general in the Nigerian army. Obasanjo was Yoruba, but he always emphasized his Nigerian identity over his ethnic background, famously saying, "I am a Nigerian who happens to be a Yoruba man. I am not a Yoruba man who happens to be a Nigerian." He preferred a simple, rural lifestyle, was known for his discipline, and maintained a rigorous work schedule, often working 18 to 20 hours a day with little sleep. He managed diabetes and high blood pressure and enjoyed playing squash. In his writings after imprisonment, Obasanjo showed a strong commitment to biblical literalism and rejected Darwinian evolution. His later works focused on Christian morality and Orthodox Pentecostal teaching, moving away from traditional culture. Obasanjo also held various chieftaincy titles, including Olori Omo Ilu, Ibogan Ologun. He was seen as a key figure among the second generation of independent African leaders, noted for managing domestic unrest, maintaining military control, contributing to the African Union, and reducing Nigeria's external debt. His approval ratings varied throughout his presidency, and he faced numerous corruption allegations, although he always claimed his actions were honest. Critics believed his time in power led him to see himself as a messianic figure, losing humility and becoming more driven by power. Obasanjo's got quite a collection of books that dive into his life, thoughts, and views. Here's a rundown of what he's penned. My Watch Volume 1, Early Life and Military. This one's all about his early days and his time in the military. My Watch Volume 2, Political and Public Affairs. Here, he talks about his political career and public life. My Watch Volume 3, Now and Then. A mix of reflections on his past and present. My Command focuses on his leadership style and experiences. Nzeogwu, a deep dive into the life of General Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu, a key figure in Nigerian history. This Animal Called Man, philosophical take on human nature. A New Dawn talks about his vision for Nigeria and Africa. Thabo Mbeki I Know, insights into South Africa's former president and their relationship. Africa through the eyes of a patriot, Obasanjo's views on Africa from a patriotic perspective. Making Africa Work, a handbook, a practical guide on how to make Africa thrive. Forging a Compact in U.S.-African Relations, the 5th David M. Abshire Endowed Lecture, 15th of December 1987, a lecture on improving U.S.-African relations. Africa in Perspective offers a broad look at Africa's challenges and opportunities. Letters to Change the World, from Pankhurst to Orwell, collection of letters aimed to inspire change. Not My Will reflects on his personal struggles and experiences. Democracy Works, Rewiring Politics to Africa's Advantage, discusses how democracy can be better utilized in Africa. Challenges of Leadership in Africa examines the various challenges leaders face on the continent. War Wounds, Development Costs of Conflict in Southern Sudan, looks into the impact of conflict on development. Guides to Effective Prayer, shares his views and methods for effective prayer. The Challenges of Agricultural Production and Food Security in Africa, talks about the issues and solutions in African agriculture. Addressing Africa's youth employment and food security crisis, the role of African agriculture in job creation, discusses how agriculture can help tackle unemployment and food security. Dust Suspended, a memoir of colonial, overseas, and diplomatic service life, 1953 to 1986, a memoir covering his service life from colonial times to the 1980s. L'Afrique en marche, un manuel pour la réussite économique, a French guide to Africa's economic success. Africa's Critical Choices, a call for a Pan-African roadmap, urges a unified approach to solving Africa's major issues. Obasanjo's books are like a roadmap of his thoughts and experiences, giving a deep dive into his journey through life and politics. And that wraps up our journey through the life and legacy of Olusegun Obasanjo. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more amazing content,